So my name is Philipe Moriel. I work at the Ranch Cattle Research and Education Center, and I'm working primarily with beef cattle nutrition and management. And I know the topic that we included in the flyer was just about preconditioning, but talking to Sarah and Krista, when we were discussing, I thought it would be more interesting if I add other types of management that could be used, just to make sure that more people would be able to adopt at least one of them, right? If they had not already done so. So instead of just focusing on preconditioning, I'm going to talk about other things, okay? So there are several things that we can do either before weaning, all right, and after weaning that can help to either promote or to decrease the immunity of that calf. And that will lead to an increase or decrease in their susceptibility to become sick when they go through stressors or when they go to feedlot, for example. And a major disease in the United States is still bovine respiratory disease. About 20 years ago, they estimated that the losses would be about almost $1 billion annually because of bovine respiratory disease. And most of it was because of cost of antibiotics, decreased performance, decreased carcass quality, you name it, all factors. From last year, it was estimated that it can actually be $2 billion nowadays. Okay, so it's a huge thing, and then there's a lot of things that we can do before and after weaning that help make this calf either stronger or you will actually make it weaker and more susceptible to this disease. Okay. Before I continue, I have to give a brief introduction about immune system so you guys have an idea of what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the presentation, but I'm not going to torture you too much. The major point that I want to talk about the immune system is think about us when you get sick. For example, what happens when you get sick? One of the first few things that we actually feel is lack of appetite, right? We don't want to eat. And that happens the same thing with animals, cattle and all other species as well. So for example, let me show you this table here. These are animals that were weaned and they were shipped, they put in a truck and they were shipped for several hours until they reached the feedlot. And this is their intake as a percentage of their body weight during the first 2 weeks in the feedlot. So you can see that in average, they were eating about 1.5%. So to give you a comparison, a calf that is not stressed, he will eat between 2.5% to 3%. So almost nearly half. And this is just the average of 2 weeks. But actually the first week that we send them to the feedlot after several stressors that they always get exposed to, their intake is actually about 0.5% of their body weight. So a calf that is 500 pounds will eat no more than 2.5 pounds of feed during the first 7 days after those major stressors, right? So that's a big problem because now the animal needs to grow, but he's not eating as much as he can. Another problem that when we have a disease, and not now lately we found out that stress can also lead to this problem that I'm going to talk about. It's not only a disease, stress itself can also do that. So vaccination, transportation, castration, weaning, commingling with new calves that we've never seen before, all of them can cause this inflammatory response, okay, in the body. And that inflammatory response leads to several physiological reactions that we don't have to be specific. But the major outcome of this inflammatory response is that an animal, instead of using nutrients to grow, he will use the nutrients to support the immune system and deal with the stress or the disease. So now the stress itself is actually acting as a nutrient drainage. Okay, so nutrients that are consumed by the animal, instead of going towards the growth, they will go towards the immune system. And the immune system always have priority over nutrients than growth. Will always be that. The animal actually needs to survive before he can grow. So whenever that happens, the nutrients are going to come from two places, either from the diet or from the muscle, okay, or adipose tissue, for example. So remember, I just showed you a slide that they're not eating. So less nutrients are coming from the diet. That means that the immune system will still require nutrients. Doesn't matter if the calf is eating or not. So it will start mobilizing muscle and adipose tissue just to support whatever nutrients is necessary to fight this disease and to go back to the normal state. So the two main things I want to talk about when you are stressed or when you have a calf that is sick is that there are two major outcomes to that. They're not eating, and whatever they eat is being shifted towards the immune system, is not being used for growth. Okay, so the goal of the whole presentation I'm going to show you is to what can we do to actually alleviate this stress. So for example, we want to lower the peak of this curve. So that means that the lower the stress, the less nutrients will be needed to support the immune system, and less nutrients will be needed to be mobilized from their tissue reserves. Okay, and the other strategies are gonna increase their intake. What can we do to increase the intake? So in that case, the calf is stressed, but he might be consuming more nutrients, and those nutrients are providing the necessary amino acids or energy to support the immune system, and therefore he doesn't need to rely on his own tissue reserves. Okay, so all the strategies that I'm going to talk to you today, which are all these, they do two main things. They either increase their consumption or they're going to alleviate the stress somehow. Okay, so the first one is creep feeding. Creep feeding, most of you already know what it is a strategy that we're able to provide the supplement to the calf, but the cow cannot have access to it, right? So whenever the calf is suckling the mother, we separate this area that we provide supplementation. Only the calf can go in and the cow will not have access to it. It's one way to make sure that the supplement is going only to the calf and not to the cow that is already fully mature. I'm not going to talk about the effects of creep feeding, that we can increase weaning weights and we can offer limited amounts or free choice amount. We can do this in a different presentation. I'm going to talk only about what does creep feeding do to their post-weaning performance. All right. So for example, this study here was done at ONA. It was done a few years ago by Dr. Arthington. And then he looked at a group of calves that did not receive creep feeding supplementation before weaning, and a group that received creep feeding 45 days before weaning, okay? And in average, they consumed close to 6 pounds a day of this supplement during the last 45 days before weaning. Then those calves were weaned, and all of them were sent to our dry lot facility so that we can measure their growth performance and their intake. So what we saw is that the calves that received creep feeding supplementation, they actually gained more during the next 29 days after weaning. Okay, this is average that they gain after weaning. They gain way more than the calves that did not receive creep feeding supplementation. And the major reason is because of this. This is how much concentrate they consumed during the first week after weaning. So calves that were creep fed, they were able to consume more supplement. And that happens because they know what to do. So because they learn to associate feed bunk with supplement and people with feed, when you wean them and you put them in a dry lot situation or you have to supplement those calves, they know exactly what to do and they start consuming right away. That's why they have a much greater consumption, and that greater consumption during a stressful time means that they're meeting their nutrient requirements better than those calves that have a lower consumption, and therefore they rely less on their tissue reserves. That's why they're gaining more, okay? Very straightforward, so we don't torture you too much. Now, what happens to the carcass weights? Not a lot of studies shows a lot of benefits of creep feeding when you do carcass weight for those that are going to retain ownership. Most of the time, you might have a heavier carcass, but that's pretty much because the calf was weaned heavier, okay? Not much, the creep feeding doesn't have a really long-term benefits to carcass. The major goal of creep feeding is to increase weaning weights and helps promote their consumption during stressful times, okay? So definitely a great setup strategy, and it is most of the time economically feasible. We can do it in most situations and do have a greater income. It just requires a little bit more labor. Now, early weaning is another strategy that might work for some of you. At ONA, what we do, we early weaned all the calves from all first calf counts. And we do that because it definitely helps the mother, because we early weaned a calf on the first day of the breeding season of this first calf count, right? When the calves are around 60 to 90 days of age. And the reason is, think about that mother now that it's no longer lactating. It doesn't have the calf, she's no longer lactating. So their nutrient requirements will go down by 25 to 30%. And those cows, they will start gaining body conditioning score faster during the breeding season compared to a first calf cow that is still providing the milk to the calf. And also now you don't have the presence of the calf itself when it's suckling causes a negative feedback on their brain, so it delays their ovulation. But when you remove the calf, that feedback is removed. So now these cows, they start ovulating sooner. Great strategy to increase pregnancy rates of first calf cows, okay? But now you have a calf that is 60 to 90 days of age. This is the day that we weaned those calves, okay? And then we put them in these cow pens with good quality hay and some supplement to teach those calves how to eat. Very important week is the first one after early weaning. But again, we can talk about early weaning in a different, more about early weaning in a different presentation. The whole goal is to say that early weaning also helps, it provides us an alternative to teach those calves how to eat. They're very flexible, okay? There's a lot of things that you can do with how to raise these animals. And this time of their lives is the highest conversion rate you're ever gonna see in their entire lives. So they convert really well whatever they eat in terms of gain. So they're very, very efficient. And also provides another, and think about it, now you're weaning this calf at 60 days of age. So when he reaches finally around 300 days of age and you're gonna ship them to somewhere, you no longer have the stress of weaning happening at that time. So you're just spreading the stress over the life of this calf, and you're not concentrating everything on the same day, which just makes it worse. Okay, so when we actually compare the performance of those animals to those that were normally weaned, let's say that we weaned them around 300 days of age, okay? So let me go back. This is two groups. One was early weaned at 85 days of age, and we raised them on pasture with supplementation until they reached 300 days of age. This group stayed with the mothers on pasture, no supplementation. They were only suckling their mothers and grazing, and we weaned them on 300 days of age. And then both groups, whenever they reached 300 days of age, they were sent to the feedlot, and we wanted to look at their performance. And you guys can see that during the receiving period, they gained almost twice, okay? This advantage gradually decreases over time as they go further into the feedlot period. But overall, when you look at the entire post-weaning period, they gain much more, almost 300 pounds more than calves that were normally weaned. And the reason for that is because they're less stressed. So when we shipped those calves and we put them in a truck, their inflammatory response is much lower. Okay, remember the figure that I showed you? That it peaks really high and then rapidly decreases? And I told you that we want to decrease the peak, right? To make it less demanding on their body. This is what happens to early wean calves. All right, this is one way that we measure their stress when we're doing research, just to make it a clear comparison. Okay, and also these calves in the feedlot, they gain much better. So now they're less stressed, they can eat more, and therefore they gain much better. So I already showed part of this table before. This is a study that we compare, remember, the animals that were did not receive creep feed before supplementation, animals that received creep feeding before weaning, and calves that were early weaned. And then we got these three groups, and then we put them in a dry lot and we measure their performance, okay? Who had the greatest performance during the 29 days after we started the study? The ones that were early weaned, right? Almost a pound more than those that didn't receive creep feed. And the reason is because they were able to consume way more concentrate, right? Their rumen is better developed. They already know what to do. They associate people with feed bump with feed. They already had their stress of weaning happen a long time ago. So when you put them in a dry lot, they know what to do. They just fly and they go very well, okay? It's a great strategy to promote the health and the performance of calves in stressful situations is if they were early weaned, right? Now, finally, into preconditioning. Works pretty much very similar to early weaning, okay? Unfortunately, preconditioning, there's no standard definition. So technically, any management practice that you do before or after weaning could be considered preconditioning. So for example, some people consider vaccination a preconditioning program. And in Texas, for example, they do receive a premium for being part of a vaccination program. they are considered preconditioned. When I was working in North Carolina, we preconditioning meant a different thing. The producers, they were very small producers that had in average about 20 head of cattle per farm, right? They over there, they like to call it farm. So one way that they decided to add value to their calves is to create a group, a preconditioning group, an alliance of producers that they combine all of their cattle, right? And they established this protocol. So everybody had to do the same protocol. They had to wean the calves, and you keep them on the ranch, right, for at least 45 to 60 days. During that period of 45 to 60 days, they were offered concentrate, right? Some kind of grain or byproduct concentrate. And also they received 2 rounds of vaccination against respiratory disease. So that protocol, and then they combined several producers and they created this big group, and they were able to find buyers that would pay a premium for those calves. When I was there, they were getting about $50 to $100 more per head by being part of this group, which more than covered the cost of feeding and the vaccinations that they got. By making this alliance, they were able to get cheaper vaccine, cheaper feed, all of that. But you had to follow this protocol that they did, and it works. So for the rest of the presentation, when I talk about preconditioning, I mean weaning the calf and keeping the calf at the range. Very similar to early weaning. But then you keep them for 60 days, feed them in a feed bunk, teach them how to consume concentrate, and then you provide 2 rounds of vaccination against respiratory disease, and then you ship those calves to the buyer. All right, that helps a lot, as I'm going to show you. One of the benefits is, like I told you, is that they know what to do. Now you just taught them how to eat. They know associate people with feed bunks with supplementation. So when you send them to the feedlot, look at their intake during the first and second week after feedlot entry, compared to those that were weaned and transported on the same day. It's almost twice on the first week and about half a percentage more during the second week. So the first 2 weeks after feedlot entry, after transportation, long hours in the truck, those calves get really stressed, dehydrated. When they go to the feedlot, the ones that were preconditioned, they can eat much faster. Okay, and this is an attractive that people can use for feedlot buyers to pay a little more for their calves. So during the most stressful time, now they had a much greater consumption. Their stress is lower because they had already gone through the stress of weaning. Their demand for nutrients to deal with the stress is less. So therefore their performance is much greater. And then when you actually look at health data, you can see the morbidity cases decreased by half. Morbidity can be also called, it looks like depression. The calves are depressed, they don't eat, they cough, they look like really depressed, and it's easy to diagnose those calves. I need to find a video that is easier to see that. And their mortality rate decreased by 10 times. So think about the saving costs that you have here just by requiring less antibiotics, not having to pull calves out of pens. You know, the calves that don't become sick, they have a better performance, they have better carcass quality, they finish earlier, so it's less days on feed. So all of those are attractives to the buyer, the feedlot buyer, so that it makes him be more willing to pay a little more for these type of calves. And I know in Texas they have several preconditioning programs. Maybe we should have one here in Florida. And in North Carolina, they also had to. But people had to get together and really mobilize a lot of people to make that happen. Okay. And in another study, like I said, calves that were preconditioning almost 4 times less morbidity cases than those that were weaned and transported on the same day. And look at that, almost 6 times less than those that were bought from auction markets and then sent to the feedlot. All right, these calves here, most of the time you don't know their history, you don't know if they received vaccination or not. They are commingled with new calves. They're transported several times, so it's very stressful for these type of animals. Now, the other thing that I want to talk to you is that as I was part of this preconditioning alliance, I started to dedicate researching to, is there anything that we can do during the preconditioning period to promote their growth and promote their health? So the first study that we did was looking at protein levels, right? Remember that figure that I showed you at the beginning? When you have a stress response, the inflammatory response is gonna happen, and you're gonna need nutrients, and they're gonna come either from the diet or from the muscle. So the hypothesis was very simple. So can I just increase the amount of protein into the diet to the point that I will actually promote their growth at higher levels than what it's going to cost me to increase their protein concentration? Okay, so the study was very simple. We weaned the calves and we offered them 3 diets that had the same amount of energy, and they provided either 85% of their protein requirements, therefore they were deficient in protein, 100%, or they were provided a little bit more than what they needed, 115% of their requirements. 85% is not that uncommon to see. Okay, for example, depending on the year, the pasture levels might not be as high as you think, and a protein supplementation that has 14% crude protein does not cover everything that the animal needs. So the 85% metabolizable protein deficiency, 15% deficiency, it's not uncommon to see, okay? And so the whole diet for these animals here, it was around 14% crude protein, the whole diet, okay, not just a supplement. And for this group here, the whole diet was 19%, all right? A little bit more protein. So what we saw was we started the study at the time of weaning, no differences in their weaning weights. And then we started preconditioning. Now look at their weights as we increase the amount of protein. About 40 pounds heavier for those that were fed extra amount of protein compared to those that were fed a protein deficient diet. All right, just this difference itself pays for the cost of the supplementation. And again, like I said, the protein deficiency is not uncommon to happen. So it really worked. So just by providing more protein to the diet, the animals rely less on their tissue reserves, and they're able to eat to grow more. We also saw that when we increased the amount of protein, they were less stressed. So those levels of inflammatory response, and cortisol is a good hormone that is highly associated with stress response. So the higher the levels of cortisol, the higher stress, the more stressed these animals are. We see that as we increase the amount of protein, they become less and less stressed. And maybe most importantly, at the end of the preconditioning period, this is the amount of antibodies that those animals produced after vaccination. Almost twice more than the animals that were protein deficient or provided 100% of their diet. So what that means is when I increase the amount of protein, I increase their consumption, I increase their gain, and at the end of the I increase their vaccine response. So with the same amount of money that you invested in vaccination, now you're sending a calf with a much greater levels of antibodies. So chances are that these calves will be it will be harder for them to become sick. So everything helped. Everything combined and worked together and promote the growth and the health of those calves. So at the time that I ran these studies, using the price of the supplement and the price of the calves, it did pay off. Might not pay off every year, right? Because calf prices fluctuate a lot, especially lately. But this is something that we might calculate how much it costs our supplement, how much is it going to cost in terms of vaccine, am I going to get a premium or not, what's the projected calf price, and we can estimate if it's going to be feasible or not to implement something like this. But it works. And it works because it alleviates the stress and help teach those calves how to eat much more. Now, another study that we did was a lot of producers, they wanted to do preconditioning on pasture scenarios, and they just want to give free choice access to pasture and provide the supplementation. But a lot of the producers that I talked to, they did not want to feed those calves every single day. They had full-time jobs, or they did not want to waste their weekends feeding cattle. They wanted to stay with the family. There were several reasons why people don't want to do it. So we decided to investigate the effects of frequency of supplementation, right, into the performance of preconditioned calves. And this concept is very simple. So instead of providing supplementation daily, you just provide the supplementation less frequently. Okay, so for example, let's say you have this animal that you're supposed to provide 3 pounds of a supplement per calf per day. This is just a hypothetical example, okay? At the end of the week, they would have consumed 21 pounds, each calf. So if you want to reduce the frequency of supplementation, you just divide that weekly amount by the number of days that you want to feed. So let's say I want to feed 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. So now I provide 7 pounds on Monday, 7 pounds on Wednesday, 7 pounds on Friday. So 7 times 3 is 21 pounds that each calf is supposed to have. So now you're still maintaining the same supplement amount that was offered to the calves over that week, but you're reducing labor by half, okay? Great way to reduce labor costs, feeding costs, and help promote the adoption of this technique, right, or management strategy. So what happened? We did a study, we weaned those calves, and then we start supplementing calves either daily or 3 times a week. Very similar to what I just showed you. And we provided 2 rounds of vaccination against respiratory disease to really challenge their immune system and see what would happen, okay? One of the first things that we see when we decrease the frequency of supplementation is this, okay? There's a fluctuation in forage intake. So animals that are supplemented daily, their forage intake over that week is going to be pretty much consistent because you're providing the same amount of supplement every single day. But the calves that are supplemented 3 times a week, they're going to fluctuate a lot. So on the days that you provide the supplementation, they're not going to graze much. So their forage intake goes down. On the next day, when you don't provide supplementation, their forage intake is going to go up. The problem is that the amount of forage that was decreased on the days that you provide the supplement are much greater. The amount is much greater than what the animal is capable of compensating on the next day. So when you calculate the average forage intake over that week, they can actually consume about 1 pound a day less of forage because you're providing less frequently. This is just because of a lot of supplement being fed at the same time, and it causes some interactions with the rumen environment that leads to a lower forage intake, right? And that explains a lot why the animals that were supplemented 3 times a week instead of daily, they gain about 0.6 pounds less per day. A lot of that is because they consume less forage. And another reason why these animals that are supplemented less frequently, they have poorer performance is because they become more stressed. So for example, this is the levels of cortisol that I told you that's a good indicator of stress levels. The red lines are the calves that are supplemented 3 times daily. And the blue line is the calves that are supplemented 3 times a week. And you can see that they have much greater levels for most part of the study when we challenge them with a vaccine. And so what it means is just make them worse. They're more stressed. So now that means that they have higher demands for nutrients. A lot of those nutrients are not going to go for growth, and it's going to go to support the stress response, deal with the stress response. Another major responses that we saw was percentage of calves that responded to the vaccination. That's what we call seroconversion. And it tells you how many calves actually produced enough antibodies that you could actually tell that this calf had a positive vaccine response. So what we saw at the end of the study is that 100% of my animals that were supplemented daily, they actually had enough, they produced enough antibodies. The ones that were supplemented 3 times weekly, only 79. So if you have 100 calves, 21 of those calves did not produce any levels of antibodies. So that means that you just wasted 2 rounds of vaccines on those calves, on 21 of those calves, right? And of those that did respond to the vaccination, they actually produced less. So everything made it worse, right? By trying to save a little bit on labor, what happened is a decreased growth by 0.6 pounds a day, made them more stressed, and I decreased their vaccine response. So what we decided to do was another study to try to fix that problem. So is there anything that we could do that could allow producers to decrease the frequency of supplementation and therefore reduce their costs without hurting the performance of the calves, okay, the growth and the immune system? So we decided to add a third treatment. So we had a group that was weaned and supplemented daily, weaned and supplemented 3 times a week during the entire study, and another group that we gradually reduced the frequency of supplementation. So instead of, for the first 14 days, we supplemented them daily. And then we reduced the frequency of supplementation to 3 times a week until the end of the preconditioning period. We only fed them daily during the stressful time. Once they were no longer stressed, then we reduced the frequency of supplementation. Okay, we thought this would help, and it did, right? So when you look at the immunological response, we actually see that the levels of stress that were very similar compared to those that were supplemented daily for the entire study. And they were much lower compared to those that were supplemented 3 times a week for the entire study. And their vaccine response was similar to those that were supplemented daily and better than the ones that were had the frequency reduced for the entire study, okay? So if you do want to do some precondition and you do want to decrease their frequency of supplementation because of whatever reason, our advice is to keep feeding them daily during the first couple of weeks when they're really stressed. And once that stress is gone and they know what to do, they know how to eat, then you can reduce the frequency of supplementation without any problems to their immune system and growth. Okay. Now, I did talk about crib feeding, early weaning, preconditioning. All of them, like I told you, they either alleviate stress and they help teach the calves to consume more feed. So the calves handle the stress better. This strategy that I'm going to show you right now, it's a little bit different, and it can actually help. It's very convenient, right? Because you're injecting every individual animal, so you know exactly how much you're providing, and you can do it at any time. You can do on weaning day, and then and help the immune system of those calves, right? So very similar to protein and energy. When an animal is undergoing stress, he also needs trace minerals because a lot of them are very important to several immunological pathways, vaccine response and killing bacteria and viruses. So here we have 2 groups, okay? A group that was weaned and vaccinated and received, vaccinated and received an injection of saline solution, which is just water with white salt, and calves that received an injectable trace mineral, all right, with copper, selenium, and zinc. So what we see is, look at the gray bars for now, okay? Just focus on these ones. You can see that we wean them, we vaccinate, and then when they're going this stressful time, their levels of zinc, copper, manganese, and selenium go down, right? Because the body is demanding more of these elements because of the stress response. But look at the ones that received the injectable trace minerals. They were able either to maintain or to increase the levels of copper and selenium during this stressful time. All right, so you provided what those calves needed during in a convenient way and during a very strategic time when you know that they need it. And we also saw that when we provide this injectable trace mineral injection, they have a better vaccine response. Okay, the mechanism doesn't matter. There are several things that we're still trying to figure it out, but it does help promote the amount of antibodies that was produced compared to those that were injected with a saline solution. Now, there is a price for it. What happens is when you inject with a trace mineral injection, usually their average daily gain during the first 14 days after they are injected is going to decrease, right, compared to those that were injected with the saline. Right, just for the first 14 days. After that, they're gonna recover this small body weight loss. And remember, this is just 14 days, so it's not that much. And the reason for their lower gain during the first 14 days after injection is because the injection itself causes an inflammatory response. It does increase their levels of copper, selenium, and zinc, but at the same time increases the level of haptoglobin, ceruloplasmin, which are indicators of inflammatory response, which is not a bad thing. We don't want to eliminate the inflammatory response. It's just a price that these animals pay. But when you look at a much longer evaluation period, instead of just 14 days, you can actually see that the calves that receive the injectable trace minerals, they do much better. So this is a study that calves that were weaned and they injected with a saline solution, or they were injected with 2 different types of injectable trace mineral products, right? don't worry about the types or anything. Just think about the concept that I'm showing you here right now. And what they saw was after 55 days of evaluation, these calves that received the injectable trace minerals, they actually had greater body weight at the end of this period compared to those that did not receive the injectable trace minerals. They had much heavier body weight, they gained more, and they were slightly more efficient. So they converted more pound. They needed less feed to convert the same amount of pound of average daily gain. Right. Another benefit that we saw is that we actually decreased the percentages of calves that were morbid or depressed and not eating compared to the control group. And just the antibiotic cost for these groups was about $4 to $5 less compared to those that received injectable trace mineral saline solution. Sorry. So it's a great strategy for stressful calves. Calves that are really undergoing stress, they're going to be weaned, they're going to be transported. The body's going to demand a lot on their trace mineral reserves. Great strategy if your calves are not consuming the trace mineral salt, which is something common that we see. So they do become deficient as they get closer to weaning. So this is a strategy that you can actually replenish their trace mineral levels very conveniently and then help the stress of these calves. I do have to say that it doesn't work all the time, right? If I had not said that, I think I would be lying to you. In cases that the calves are not stressed, we don't see much a benefit of the injection. And it's very logical, right? If they're not really stressed, they're not having demands on their nutrient, their reserves for trace mineral. Also, we didn't see much of a benefit if the calves were not stressed and they had free choice access to the trace mineral salt, and you know that they're consuming enough, right? You were able to tell that their calves are consuming enough. So at the time of weaning, they're not deficient in trace minerals. In that case, we didn't see much of a benefit. But most of the times, calves are deficient at the time of weaning. You don't know their trace mineral status at the time of weaning, and they will have a better performance when you use this type of strategy. Great strategy, for example, if you're buying calves at auction markets, and so you don't know where the calf came from, you don't know how much trace mineral salt these animals were consuming. So if you're bringing to your ranch and you're going to grow these calves as stockers or replacement heifers, this is a good strategy to give to them and replenish their trace mineral status quickly, right? It's not a replacement for trace mineral supplementation. It's just another tool that we can use on the top of it. Now, the last strategy that I want to show you, so you guys can all enjoy the rest of your night, is about fetal programming. This is a type of research that we've been focusing a lot. And I'm not going to talk about weaning or carcass quality or anything. I'm going to focus only on health. So a few years ago, fetal programming is this concept that by changing the nutrition of a pregnant cow, you can actually change the environment in the placenta, okay, to the point that it affects how the calf is developing during gestation and affects how they're going to perform in the future. So for example, this is a study that about 11 years ago, they showed that calves that are born from cows that had better nutrition during the pre-calving phase, 10 times less calves developed respiratory problems when they were sent to a feedlot during a stressful situation. All right. And we're still trying to figure it out what happens. And my lab at ONA is trying to focus on that. And we do focus a lot on how they respond to the vaccination, depending on how their mothers were fed. So we ran this study for a couple of years, and we just published that. And if you want more details about these studies, I can send you later. That we had, this is pounds, okay? It's not kilos. I'm sorry for that. So we had a group of heifers that were pregnant for the first time, and they received no supplementation before calving or molasses with urea for about 70 days before they calved. About 2 pounds of molasses with urea for 70 days before they calved. Once they calved, everybody was treated exactly the same. So what we saw was the calves that are born from those cows that received supplementation, They had a much greater average daily gain after birth, right? And the reasons are several that we don't need to talk about right now. But what happened to their health? We had a much better response to the vaccination compared to those calves that were born to cows that did not receive pre-calving supplementation, right? 84 against 56% for bovine viral diarrhea virus, which is one of the main pathogens that cause bovine respiratory disease, and also parainfluenza 3, which is another virus responsible for respiratory disease. 100% compared to 84. And I'm only showing one table, but we ran several studies for the last 4 years, and this is very consistent. Calves that are born from cows that receive better nutrition during pre-calving, they seem to have better performance after birth, so they're going to be heavier weaned. We have some data showing that they do have better carcass quality too, and their health, somehow they have better response to the vaccination. So in theory here, you have more calves that are better protected against the disease compared to those that had poorer nutrition during pre-calving phase. Okay, now just to summarize everything I said, I know I try to be direct as direct as I could because it's really late. I didn't want to bother you guys too much. The major goal of the whole presentation is to show you that when they are stressed, not only sick, but also the stress itself, weaning, vaccination, transportation, castration, all of that makes these calves enter a physiological state that they don't eat, and most of what their nutrients that they are consuming are being drained, right? They're not going towards growth. So what you can do is to help them eat better or alleviate the stress. So preconditioning, crib feeding, early weaning, they do both. Increase consumption, alleviate stress. Injectable trace minerals, you replenish the trace mineral reserves, and you help their performance. And fetal programming, which we're still figuring out what actually happens. I just wanted to throw you the concept, so you know what's going on, is that better nutrition during gestation seems to very consistently lead to better health of those calves. I know I just covered the basics of every strategy, and because each one of them, if you do want to implement or if you do want to change whatever you're doing, we have to work with you on an individual basis. It really depends on your calves and where you are and pasture amount, pasture quality, all kinds of factors that you guys know. So it's very easy for me to say, if you have any question, I can always say it depends. So, but we're here to help you if you do want to implement any of these strategies, or if you do want to, if you have any questions about it, you can send me an email, contact Sarah or Krista, or call us at home.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Moriel. That was excellent. There was also so much information in there and just so many things to think about. And there was actually one question that popped up while you were talking.
Yeah.
And do you see that question? I can also read it, which I'll just read it in case anyone is not looking at their screen right now. And it's which weaning method do you recommend? Fence line?
Most of them are. You're gonna find studies that did show that it helps, other studies that doesn't help. So, for example, we do some sort of fence line at one, for example. So when we wean our calves, and some of them have to stay at the center, we keep them in the cow pen, so they're very protected. And the cows are gonna sit really nearby them, so they can see, they can smell, and they cannot suckle, but we do. And that does seems to help. Do whatever you can. If you can do fence line weaning, do it. It does help. If you cannot, then put them in a very secure place that you know they're not going to jump, and try to help them during that first week. Something that helps extremely well, and if you start doing it, you will realize it. What I'm talking about. When we do early wean calves, because they're so young, for 60, 90 days of age, they cannot go off feed, right? Because they really have to eat really fast. So something that we do, we provide the best hay that we can and a very dense supplement. But for the first week, we go visit those calves 6, 7, 8 times during the day. So we go in the we pour a little bit of feed, okay? We stay a few minutes with them, 30 minutes, 20 minutes. Let them acclimate to you. Then you leave, and then you go back a few hours later. Clean up the feed bunk because they're gonna defecate, urinate on the top of the feed. Clean it up, pour new quality feed, and after 2 to 3 days that you do that, I know it's a lot of time. It helps tremendously. Tremendously. We can see the years that when we do it really well and years that we don't, how much difference it does to the calf behavior and performance after we do this type of strategy. So attention is something that helps a lot if you cannot do fence line. But even during the fence line, if you're able to do it, do what I just said about the supplementation. It helps a lot to help them acclimate to you faster.
Great. And a question from Lauren. Does preconditioning lead to a quicker finishing weight?
It can, yes. If animals are heavier at the end of the preconditioning phase and your buyer is going to slaughter them at a set weight, a fixed weight, then yes, right? Let's say you have 10, 20, 25 pounds advantage compared to those that were not preconditioned. And in the feedlot, average daily gain in average would be, let's say, 2 pounds. That's at least 10 days that you could save if you're gonna slaughter them on a fixed weight. Now, if you're not gonna do that, if they're gonna be commingled with other groups of calves, then you lose some of that advantage. So yeah, potentially can, depending on what you do.